Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So welcome to the Monday meeting and another episode in our series commenting on Kitab, at-Tawheed, the book of Islamic monotheism by Shaykh al-Imam al-Mujaddid Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And we have reached chapter number 11, which is the chapter that the Imam has entitled Babu La Yudbahu Lillahi Bimakanin Yudbahu Fihi Li Ghayrillah. It's the chapter which he has entitled No one should sacrifice for Allah's sake in a place where sacrifices are made to other than Allah. No one should sacrifice for Allah's sake in a place where sacrifices are made to other than Allah. So if you remember last week, we commented on the chapter Babu al-Dhabhu li Ghayrillah, the chapter of sacrificing or regarding the ruling concerning sacrificing for other than Allah. So now the Imam brings another chapter which he talks about sacrificing. But here he talks about sacrificing for Allah, but in a place where sacrifices are done for other than Allah. So there is obviously a relationship between the two chapters because both of them talk about al-dhabh, but they're also different. So the relationship between the two chapters is that both pertain to sacrificing, as we said. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The first one speaks to the ends, what we call al-maqasid. It speaks to the ends, the sacrificing itself. And the second one speaks to the wasa'il, the ways and the means. So basically, the first chapter tells us the ruling of the ends, al-maqasid. And the second chapter tells us the ruling of al-wasa'il, the ways and means to the achievement of that end. But both, what we're going to see is that both share the same ruling. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to see that both share the same ruling. So the first one, sacrificing for other than Allah, that end is forbidden because it is forbidden, as we say, lidhatihi. It is forbidden because it is inherently idolatrous. It is inherently idolatrous. That's why it's prohibited. It itself is a crime. It's inherently idolatrous. So basically, because a dhabh is an act of worship, if you offer it to other than Allah, you automatically have done a shirk. And a shirk is what? Prohibited. It's the greatest prohibition. So it's prohibited because it is an act of shirk. It is inherently idolatrous. While the second one is prohibited min bab sadd dhari'ah, out of an abundance of caution. Out of an abundance of caution. So basically, we have something in our religion called sadd al-dhari'ah, which means barring the paths and impeding the progress that leads to evil. Or everything that leads to evil, our religion prohibits it. Okay? So basically, let me digress a little bit and explain why this chapter that the Imam brought is a very wise move on his part. And it's a very important thing that we have to understand as it relates to our religion generally. Our concept that's important for us to understand as it relates to our religion generally and as it relates to at-Tawheed specifically. So basically what the Imam is teaching us by bringing this chapter after talking about sacrificing for other than Allah, he brings a chapter about sacrificing to Allah, but in a place where sacrifices for other than Allah take place. And what he's teaching us is this general principle in our religion that when something is prohibited, when something in our religion is prohibited, think of anything. Think of murder. Think of a zina, adultery and fornication. Think of drinking alcohol. Anything prohibited in our religion, it alone is not prohibited. Allah does not just prohibit the act itself, but He also prohibits every likely or probable means to that end. So when Allah prohibits murder, He doesn't just prohibit murder, but He prohibits everything that could lead to murder. When He prohibits zina, adultery and fornication, He doesn't just prohibit that, but He prohibits everything that could lead to it. When He prohibits the drinking of alcohol, He doesn't just prohibit that, He prohibits everything that could lead to it. And that's why you find the Prophet ﷺ prohibiting a Muslim from sitting at a table where wine is being poured. Okay? Because if you're sitting at a table where wine is being poured, you could what? Ultimately, drink the wine. So you'll find in the Quran and even in the Sunnah, like this example that we just gave, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frequently, when He prohibits an end, He prohibits its means as well. And I'll give some examples. So the first example is the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to ladies, in the passage in Surah An-Nur, where He's mentioning the hijab. He's mentioned the khimar, that women should cover their heads with the khimar and that they should dress modestly and the different etiquettes that they should observe to project modesty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَضْرِبْنَ بِأَرْجُلِهِنَّ لِيُبْدِينَ مَا يُخْفِينَ مِنْ زِينَتِهِنَّ. So He says, and let the women not stamp their feet, thereby drawing attention to their hidden adornments. So He tells women not to stamp their feet. Now, stamping your foot, is that haram in and of itself? Why does Allah prohibit it? Not because it itself is inherently criminal, but because it could lead to what? It could lead to calling the attention, drawing the attention of men towards women and their desire being aroused, right? And that could ultimately lead to what? The prohibited thing, which is adultery and fornication. And so this is an example of Allah prohibiting something not because it itself is inherently criminal or bad, but because it could lead to something bad. Another example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, the 6th chapter, He says, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. He says, do not curse those idols that they worship besides Allah, because they will in turn curse Allah out of hostility without knowledge. So what just happened there? Allah prohibited the believers from saying bad things about false deities. Now, honestly, whatever they say about the false deities is going to be true. If they say these are false deities, if they say these deities cannot benefit or harm, if they say these deities, it's foolish to worship them, anything they say, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, anything they say would be truthful. But when they say those things, it could lead the disbelievers who they're saying it about, who are offended and come to the defense of their idols, it could lead them in defense of their idols to say bad things about Allah. So since this act can bring about this undesirable end, this prohibited end, Allah prohibited what? The act. The means to that end, Allah prohibited. That's another example. Another example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Do not come close, do not approach fornication, adultery. What is Allah saying? He's saying that not just am I prohibiting you from doing the act of adultery and fornication, but everything that leads up to it. He also says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَقْرَبُوهَا. He says, these are the limits, the legal limits of Allah, so do not approach them, do not come near to them. And then last but not least, we have the famous hadith, we have the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he was living in a time in Medina when people had become Muslim in name only. And they were infiltrating the Muslim ranks and basically plotting against the Muslims and trying to undermine Islam and destroy Islam from within, the hypocrites. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed the Prophet by divine revelation, or through divine revelation, that informed him who these hypocrites were, identified who the hypocrites were. And so once he knew who they were and the danger was evident, this existential threat was evident, Some of the companions came to the Prophet and said, well, now that you know who they are and the threat that they pose because they've infiltrated the faith, you should kill them. You should execute them. You should assassinate them. And the Prophet, ﷺ, he said, no, I'm not going to do that. لا يحدث الناس أن محمدا يقتل أصحابه. People are not going to go around saying that Muhammad kills his followers. So what was the Prophet afraid of? Honestly, isn't treason a crime in every sovereign nation? It is. And if people plot against the government and their plot is exposed, they are guilty of a crime, and generally the punishment for that crime is execution. So if the Prophet had executed these people, he wouldn't have been doing anything wrong. But he withheld from doing the right thing, right? Because this means would have led to a prohibited or undesirable end. And what is that undesirable end? Many people would have said, I don't want to become Muslim, because as far as they knew, these people are Muslim. That's all they don't know what Allah revealed to the Prophet. They just know, as far as we can tell, these people are Muslims, and Muhammad, the leader of the Muslims, is killing them. You guys see that? So these are a few examples that drive home the point that the Imam is making at the outset, or making by bringing this chapter. Remember, last week we spent an extensive amount of time talking about sacrificing for other than Allah and the ruling of that. Now he brings a chapter, no one should sacrifice for Allah's sake, which is an act of worship. It's a good thing, it's prescribed. No one should do that if they do it in a place where slaughtering for other than Allah or sacrificing for other than Allah takes place. What is that? What is this here? This is a dhari'ah. It is a means to a prohibited end. The fear is that if you sacrifice for Allah in a place where where sacrificing for other than Allah takes place, you will ultimately do what? One of two things. Either you'll give the impression that you're sacrificing to other than Allah, and that'll promote it, or it may lead you ultimately to sacrifice to other than Allah, like these other people who do it do. So because of that, so that's the connection between the two chapters. Now, one more point before we get into the chapter is that some of the scholars who have commented on Kitab, at-Tawheed have mentioned that this concept of not doing something legitimate in a place where illegitimate things are done, he says, or the scholars say, it's not specific to a dhabh, it's not specific to sacrificing, but rather every act of worship is prohibited if it is offered in a place where the worship of other than Allah takes place. So every act of worship to Allah is prohibited if it's done, or it's prohibited to do it in a place where the worship of other than Allah takes place. Okay? Or worship in that place is offered in a prohibited way. Or criminal acts are committed therein. You guys understand that? So basically, what he's saying is that we have to understand as Muslims that even if we're doing the right thing, we have to be mindful of the place where we do it. The right thing done in the wrong place is what? Is prohibited as well. Because doing the right thing in the wrong place could lead us ultimately to do the wrong thing. You guys see that? And that's the message that the Imam is bringing or trying to explain or present to us when he brings this chapter. No one should sacrifice for Allah in a place where slaughtering or sacrificing for other than Allah takes place. So now he's going to bring two texts to support this principle that he's giving us. And the first one is ayah number 108, the 108th verse from Surah At-Tawbah, the 9th chapter of the Quran. But in reality, as we're going to see, we need both verses, 107 and 108, to really drive home the point. So he brings 108 and he says, وَلَا تَقُمْ فِيهِ أَبَدًا لَمَسْجِدٌ أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى مِنْ أَوَّلِ يَوْمٍ أَحَقُّ أَنْ تَقُومَ فِيهِ رِجَالٌ يُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَتَطَهَّرُوا وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَطَهِّرِينَ. He says, وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُطَّهِّرِينَ. Never stand you therein. Do not offer prayer. He's telling the Prophet, and by extension the believers, never pray, never offer prayer therein. And we're going to talk about what he's talking about. Verily, the mosque whose foundation was laid from the first day on piety is more worthy that you stand therein to pray. In it are men who love to clean and to purify themselves, and Allah loves those who make themselves clean and pure. So this is just one part. There's two verses that apply to this this matter. And to get clarity, we need to read the first verse as well. So let's do that. So this verse that we just read and the preceding one were revealed in reference to something called Masjid al-Dirar, the Masjid of harm, or the harmful masjid, or the masjid that was built with a nefarious intent, we could say, right? With a nefarious intent. So that verse, when he says, وَلَا تَقُمْ فِيهِ أَبَدًا, don't pray, don't stand and offer prayer therein ever. He's talking about what? Masjid al-Dirar, the masjid that was built with a nefarious intent, with malicious intent, for evil purposes and with an evil intent, right? So the first verse kind of gives us a little more clarity about why Allah prohibited the Muslims from praying therein. But mind you, because we're going to ask you in a second, how is this connected to the title of the chapter and the issue that the chapter is trying to address? That basically Allah is telling the Prophet, well, let me ask you, prayer, is it something good or bad? It's something good. Is it something legislated and prescribed? Is it part of our religion? Yes. But he told the Prophet not to pray, not at all. Is he tell the Prophet, don't, just from this day on, don't pray anymore? Is that what he told him? Told him not to what? Don't pray in this place. Even though the deed you're doing is good, don't do that good deed in this bad, in this bad place. And it's similar to what the Imam is saying when he says, sacrificing should only be for Allah. The last chapter was just about sacrificing for Allah, sacrificing for Allah, sacrificing for Allah, and for none other. Then he brings a chapter and says, we can't sacrifice for Allah or to Allah in a place where sacrificing for other than Allah takes place. Don't do this good thing in what? In a bad place. You guys see that? طيب. So now let's read the first verse, which is 107. And in that verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا مَسْجِدًا ضِرَارًا وَكُفْرًا وتفريقا بين المؤمنين وإرصادا لمن حارب الله ورسوله من قبل ولا يحلفن إن أردنا إلا الحسنى والله يشهد إنهم لكاذبون. He says, as for those who established a mosque only to cause harm, to promote disbelief, to divide the believers, and as a base of operations for those who had previously fought against Allah and His Messenger, they will most certainly swear, we had only the best of intentions, but Allah bears witness that they are lying for sure. Okay? So now that gives more clarity to why Allah told him, لا تقم فيه أبدا, right? Don't pray therein ever. Because this mosque, although it was called a mosque, it was built what? It was built for other purposes. The mosque was like a front. It's like a person has a car wash, but they sell drugs or alcohol or moonshine out of the car wash. The car wash is just a front for their illicit activity. It's trying to legitimize or give a legitimate impression for the work that they do and the commerce that they're involved in. Similarly, they built a mosque, and he says, to cause harm, to promote disbelief, to divide the believers, and as a base of operations for those who had previously fought against Allah. It was basically an outpost by which they could spy upon the Muslims, try to get a heads up, and undermine and make machinations against whatever they were doing, counter whatever they were doing. Okay, so there's a backstory to this, so we can come full circle and understand how this is fitting the chapter. There's a backstory. So obviously before the Prophet ﷺ came to Al-Madinah, when it was still called Yathrib, you had two tribes that were very prominent tribes. One of them was Al-Khazraj from the Ansar, right? The non-Jewish or the pagan Arabs who lived in Yathrib. They had two tribes, two main tribes. They were Al-Aws wal-Khazraj. Al-Khazraj, there was a man from amongst them, his name was Abu Amr al-Rahib. And this Arabi guy, this Arab guy who was a pagan, had become a Christian. And he learned the scriptures, and he was given to various forms of devotion. He became a very devoted Christian. He was an avid worshiper. And that knowledge of the scriptures and that worship in a way which was respected by the pagans gave him a certain level of prestige, a certain level of cachet with Al-Khazraj or the Khazrajis, right? So he became like someone who was looked up with a great deal of respect and honor amongst the Khazrajis. And when the Prophet ﷺ came and assumed absolute authority in Al-Madinah, this Abu Amr, he became openly hostile to the Prophet ﷺ, to the Muslims, and to Islam. He became openly hostile. And he got to a point because now when the Prophet becomes the supreme authority, people like him who had a lot of prestige and cachet, they lose a lot of that prestige, that cachet, that importance, that status. They lose that because people are no longer having respect for them and the knowledge he has as a Christian or the acts of worship he did. Now people's intention was turning toward Islam and Islamic devotion and the Islamic belief system. And so people like him lost a lot of that prestige. So this frustrated him. And just being hostile toward the Prophet and the Muslims wasn't getting him anywhere. So he fled to Mecca. He fled to Mecca and he basically fostered an alliance between himself and the pagans there. So when the pagans came to fight the believers for the Battle of Uhud, he came with them. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he says they previously fought against Allah and his messenger. He's talking about his fighting against the believers at Uhud. And while he was at Uhud, who are the people he's facing? Some of the people he's facing on the battlefield are the Ansar, which are formed from these two tribes, Al-Aws wal-Khazraj. So he has friends and affiliations and former companions from Al-Khazraj. So he's using the opportunity while he's fighting them, when fighting the believers at Uhud, he's using the opportunity to try to convince them to become traitors and to abandon the cause and to abandon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. So he was trying to convince them and nobody accepted his proposals, but he did try. He did attempt to. So after the Battle of Uhud, he fled to Heraclius, the king of Rome. Okay, so he left the pagans and he went to the king of Rome, hoping, I guess, again, to garner support from someone who could help him defeat or support him in his efforts to defeat the Prophet ﷺ and to overthrow the Islamic State in Al-Madinah. So he's plotting against the Muslims there. And he writes to some of the hypocrites in Al-Madinah seeking their support. And what does he ask them to do? He asked them to establish an outpost which could be a base of operations for him when he returns. So basically, I want you guys to set up some place that I can, when I return to Al-Madinah, I can use it as a place to run my opposition campaign against the Prophet ﷺ. So they did what he asked. But they're thinking to themselves, okay, how can we do this outpost in a way that will not attract attention to ourselves and what our real intentions are? So in order not to alert the Prophet and the believers to their true intentions, they built a masjid. We don't want them to think that we're actually plotting against them. So we have to build a car wash instead of what? A dope house, right? We have to build a car wash. And so they built a masjid. And they built it near another masjid, the Masjid of Quba, which kind of made it odd, right? Because it's like if I build a masjid right next door to this masjid, that you start to say right there, it starts to make you question a person's intentions. Now, if I build it in another neighborhood, miles away, then you say, yeah, that kind of makes sense because people won't have to travel all this way. They can, like that, right? But if you do it nearby, it kind of raises eyebrows. Al-Muhim, so they built this mosque near Quba to serve as this outpost for Abu Amr al-Rahib and the hypocrites, right? So then they really want to make it legitimate. They want to give it legitimacy. They want to give it legitimacy and prevent people from questioning, right? Or those red flags from being raised. We got this masjid right next door or nearby to Quba. People are going to question. We need to make it legitimate and make people stop talking or questioning or being suspicious. So what did they do? They went to the Prophet ﷺ and they asked him to come and visit them and pray in the mosque. Can you come and offer a prayer in the masjid? They felt that if the Prophet comes and prays in the masjid, this will be an indication of his blessing and approval. He's okay with it. How can it be wrong? The Prophet prayed there. You guys see that? People would say, how can it be wrong? The Prophet prayed there. So they invited him. And the Prophet initially, at the time when they invited him, he was preparing to go out to the battle or go out for the battle of Tabuk. So he said, Innana fi safar. He said, we're about to travel, but once we return, then inshallah, we'll come and pray. So in order to convince the Prophet, to really, really give legitimacy and make the Prophet think that, yeah, everything is above board, they said, listen, we know it's close to Quba, we know it kind of looks bad, but we only did this because the people in our neighborhood, some of them are infirm. And it's difficult for them to make it all the way to Quba, or even more so to make it all the way to your mosque. And we want to make it easy on these people who have an excuse, they have a physical illness or ailment, want to make it easy on them to offer prayer in congregation. And sometimes there's inclement weather. And so even the people who are able-bodied, it's difficult for them in rain or extreme cold to come to what? These other masajid. The closer the mosque, the more likely they are to come and pray. So the Prophet, again, inshallah, I'll come, I'll pray after I return. But while the Prophet was out and on his returning from Tabuk, Allah revealed these verses that we just read, 107 and 108 from Surah Tawbah, in which he told the Prophet, La taqum fihi abadan. Don't ever pray therein. Don't ever do this good deed in what? In this bad place. So now, having said all of that, what's the relationship between the title of the chapter and this verse that the Imam cited as an evidence? What do we take from all of that? What do we take from all of that? Summarize in your own words, nothing fancy, but what is his message, and how is the verse supporting his message? How is the verse supporting his message? First of all, when he says, don't sacrifice to Allah in a place where sacrificing to other than Allah is done. What is the purpose of saying that? After mentioning a chapter that talks about sacrificing to Allah, and you shouldn't sacrifice for other than Allah, he brings this chapter, don't sacrifice to Allah in a place where sacrificing other than Allah is done. What's the connection there? What's the basic message, huh?
The only connection, what you said earlier, is don't do this good thing in that bad place.
Son, don't do this good thing in this bad place. Then he's going to cite some evidence to support that premise, right? To support that premise. And he brings the ayah where he says, La taqum fihi abada. He says to the Prophet, don't stand therein at all, ever, under any circumstances. What's the connection? What's the connection?
Don't go make salah in that bad place.
Don't pray, which is a good thing, in that place where they're doing bad things, and the place was established with bad intentions, right? And the way that they're worshiping, they're not worshiping for God's sake. They're worshiping to what? To cover up their nefarious intentions. In other words, don't do this good thing in what? In a bad place. Why? Because it's criminal to pray? Will your prayer not be accepted? No. Because it could lead to something evil. It could lead to something evil. We don't do the good things in the bad places because it could lead us to do what? The bad things in those places, right? So our religion doesn't just tell us, don't worship other than Allah. But don't even worship Allah where other than Allah is worshipped. Because being in that environment could induce you, could entice you, could influence you to worship other than Allah, like these people who do that. You guys see that? You guys see that? And so this is what we mean when we say that we talk about at-Tawheed being Islamic monotheism. We have to qualify it. It's not just monotheism. It's Islamic monotheism. It's different from the monotheism which is claimed by the other divinely revealed religions. Because they won't say you can't, they'll say you can worship God anywhere. They'll say, obviously incorrectly, God is everywhere. Yes, his knowledge is everywhere. His hearing and sight is everywhere. He's not physically everywhere, but they'll actually say God is everywhere. So you can worship God in the toilet. That's what they say. You can worship Allah in a place where what? People are worshiping other than Allah, right? People are there at a shrine and they're worshiping some dead saint in his grave. And they'll say you can worship God there because God is everywhere. But our religion says we don't worship Allah in a place where other than Allah is worshipped. Because our religion is so strict as far as guarding at-Tawheed that not only do we not do the wrong thing, we don't do the things that could lead to the wrong thing. You guys see that? And that's the point that the Imam is driving home by this chapter. We don't just not do the wrong thing. We don't do the things that could lead to the wrong thing. Now he's going to give a hadith which is even more clear in terms of its indication of the point he's trying to make. And that's the hadith of Thabit bin Dhahak. And in it, he says, نذر رجل أن ينحر إبلا ببوانة فسأل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال هل كان فيها وثن من أوثان الجاهلية يعبد فقالوا لا قال فهل كان فيها عيد من أعيادهم قالوا لا فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أوفي بنذرك فإنه لا وفاء لنذر في معصية الله ولا فيما لا يملك ابن آدم. He said, a man made a vow to sacrifice a camel at a place called Buwana. So he asked the Prophet about it. So he made a vow. I obligate myself to slaughter a camel at Buwana. Why did he do that? Allah knows best. Maybe he said, if Allah gives me a son. He had 8 daughters and he wants a son. He says, if Allah gives me a son, I'm going to slaughter a camel at Buwana. I'm going to travel this long distance with a camel and slaughter it there for Allah's sake. I'm going to make this additional sacrifice. I'm going to do this act of worship, which I'm not required to do, out of thankfulness for Allah. You guys see that? That's what he means by a vow. So a man made a vow to sacrifice a camel at a place called Buwana. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ about it. He said, so the Prophet started asking him questions. He wanted to make sure of certain things. And if he was certain of these certain things, if the man could check these boxes, he would allow him. So he said, did the place where you want to slaughter, Buwana, is there an idol there which is worshipped? What is, in effect, what is the Prophet saying? If they're doing this bad thing in this place, don't do that good thing there, right? So he's asking him, are they doing bad things there? The first bad thing he asked him, is there an idol there that's worshipped? So the people, he didn't ask the man because the man might, out of, desire to do it, he might not be entirely truthful. So he asked the people, as far as you guys know, is there an idol there that's worshipped? قالوا لا. They said, no, there's no idol in Buwana. So then he said, is there a festival or a recurring festival from their festivals that is celebrated there? Right? هل كان فيها عيد من أعيادهم? Is there a recurring festival from their festivals that they celebrate there? The people said, no, there's no festival that they observe there. So the Prophet said what? He said, okay, then go and fulfill your vow. Verily, there is no fulfilling of a vow made if that vow involves disobedience to Allah or if it's beyond a person's capacity. طيب. So now, there's one thing I want to mention about the hadith before we get to the masail and we close out. Because he mentioned this concept of al-Eid or al-Ayat. One of the things that was going to prevent him from letting the man fulfill his oath was if there was a recurring festival that they celebrated there. You guys see that? So what is the Prophet teaching us in effect? He's teaching us that al-Ayat, I'm going to talk about what that means shortly. That al-A'yad are generally prohibited in Islam. And what is an A'yad? A'yad is the plural of Eid. And an Eid has basically 2 meanings. Now we know the word Eid commonly as a holiday or celebration. So for example, we say Eid al-Fitr, the celebration of the festival of fast breaking. We say Eid al-Adha, the festival or the celebration of sacrificing. Commonly, we associate al-Eid with an occasion, a time, a season, a part of the year, right? That does what? That recurs. And that's one of the meanings of Eid. So an Eid could be a recurring occasion, a recurring season, a holiday, a celebration, a day that's what? That's celebrated and honored and observed. But it can also be a special place that is celebrated or frequented for some perceived intrinsic significance. So sometimes the intrinsic significance is associated with what? A day or a season. And sometimes the intrinsic significance is associated with what? With a place. That this place is somehow special. You guys see that? So let's look at the occasions first to give some examples and make sure we're understanding and tracking together and on the same page. So an example of an occasion which has some perceived significance and it's celebrated because of that perceived importance or significance that is intrinsic to that date, that occasion, is, for example, birthdays. A person celebrates his birthday. What does that birthday do? It recurs, right? It recurs every year. And every year he celebrates it because it's particularly significant to him. That particular day is intrinsically significant because that was the day upon which he was born, right? So that day has a significance which is inseparable from it. That's the day I was born on. He doesn't celebrate it a week later. Doesn't celebrate it 3 days before. He celebrates that day because that's what is intrinsically significant because that was the day I was born on. Another example would be 4th of July. The 4th of July. Another example would be anniversaries. A couple gets married, all right? And every year people see them go out on the 12th of August, let's say. They go out, no matter what day the 12th of August falls on, they go out on 12th of August. People say, every 12th of August, I could mark my calendar. If I see you guys all dressed up, get in your best car and go out, I know this is the 12th of August, right? Why do you guys do that? Say, well, this is the day we were what? We were married. So for them, that date has intrinsic what? Significance. There's an intrinsic significance, a significance which is infused in that day because that was the day they were married, right? Holidays, you could just continue to mention examples. This is what we mean by what? Al-Ayad or Eid when it comes to what? Occasions. It could also be places though. It can also be places as the Prophet asked them, Hal kana fiha Eidun min a'yadihim. Is this a place of what? Of special significance to them, to the idol worshippers, right? Do they celebrate a certain festival there? Or is the place itself particularly significant to them? So the place could be an Eid. And what would be an example? An example would be, for example, the grave of a pious person. A place that people what? They go there. And they go to that place specifically because that person is buried there. That gives it that intrinsic significance. So, for example, they go to a cemetery, huge cemetery, and they all stand what? In one spot. They don't stand 3 yards this way, 10 yards that way. They stand in this spot. Why this spot? Because to them, because this person was buried there, it's intrinsically significant. It should be celebrated. It should be visited. It should be honored and lauded because what? Because the burial of this person makes it especially significant. Another example would be, let's say there was, for example, a masjid where a pious person allegedly prayed, right? So, for example, one of the great conquerors was no, it's not the one. Al-Ayyubi. What's his first name? Al-Ayyubi. I'm trying to remember his first name. I can't remember his first name, Al-Ayyubi, but he was the one who conquered Constantinople, right? So let's say he prayed in a particular mosque. And so now people will go to that mosque because, this is the mosque where Al-Ayyubi offered prayer. So it's particularly significant to them because Al-Ayyubi prayed in that mosque, right? Another example would be a strip of land where supposedly a miracle occurred, right? There was this miracle that occurred, and because it occurred there, people will go there. Al-Muhim, not to just to give these examples, but not to digress too much, is that when the Prophet talks about the prohibition of al-a'yad in this hadith and in other hadith, he's not just talking about occasions, but he's also talking about places which in the minds of people have an intrinsically important, an intrinsic importance or intrinsic significance, right? And all of them are prohibited because the Prophet wasn't going to let him fulfill his oath if there was an Eid that was celebrated there, or that place was intrinsically important to the non-Muslims, meaning you're targeting it because you believe it's important, like the idolaters believe the place is intrinsically important or significant, right? We also have the hadith, another hadith that the Prophet, another hadith that we have that's indicative that these a'yad, these occasions and places are prohibited. These special occasions and places are prohibited that recur, is the hadith collected by Abu Dawood and Nasa'i from Anas, in which he said, قدم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم المدينة ولهم يومان يلعبون فيهما فقال لهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هذا اليومان قالوا يومان كنا نلعب فيهما في الجاهلية فقال إن الله قد أبدلكم بهما ما هو خير منهما يوم الفطر ويوم الأضحى. So in this hadith, you're going to notice that the Prophet ﷺ, as Anas said, he said he came to Al-Madinah and he found the people of Medina, the Ansar, who had converted to Islam. He found them celebrating 2 days, right? So they had this what? These 2 Eids, these recurring days every year that they would celebrate. And the Prophet asked them, what are these 2 days that you celebrate? They said, these are 2 days we used to celebrate in Jahiliyyah, before we became Muslims. So the Prophet said, indeed Allah has replaced these 2 days with 2 days which are superior to them. The day of fast breaking and the day of sacrifice. So the scholars of Islam, when they reflected upon this hadith, they considered it very significant that the Prophet used a specific word to explain the process that had taken place. He used the word ibdal. To what? To exchange or to replace. So now think about yourself. If you go to a mall and you buy a shirt, right? And you really like the shirt. You get home, you try it on, and it doesn't fit. It's too big. It swallows you. Or it's too small. You can barely what? Get the buttons buttoned. But you really like the shirt. And they had multiple sizes. You're always a medium. So you got a medium, but this medium is cut really big or really small. So you're saying, okay, I need to go back and what? Change it for a different size. When you go back and you go through that whole process, do you leave with 2 shirts or 1 shirt? 1 shirt. You have to give up one to take what? To take the other one. So when the Prophet used the word ibdal, it's as if he's telling the Muslims, you have to abandon these holidays and accept the holidays of what? Of Islam. You have to accept the Eids of Islam. And so the scholars of Islam said what the Prophet is teaching us is the Muslims are supposed to celebrate their Eids and celebrate their special places and only those places. You guys see that? And so because of that, we have to understand that al-a'yad, these special places and places of special significance are prohibited in Islam, and these special occasions are prohibited in Islam, except those which Islam has legislated and prescribed. So for example, Masjid al-Haram, the sacred mosque in Mecca, that's what? That's an Eid. That's a place where we're allowed and prescribed to go there and honor it and like target it. A person actually says, you know what, I'm going to buy plane tickets with the intention of going to what? To Masjid al-Haram. Al-Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet's mosque. Al-Quds, the masjid in Palestine. These are places that, a person could what? Could actually go there with the intention of going there because they are special by Islamic standards or according to Islam. But they couldn't go, like, as we said, to some of these other places that people have deemed special, which we have no support for except what? The beliefs of the non-Muslims. Let's go now to the Masail. We'll take a few of them. So he says, important issues of the chapter. We'll look at number 2. He says, إن المعصية قد تؤثر في الأرض وكذلك الطاعة. He said that sinfulness or sinful behavior, disobedience to Allah, impacts their perception and ruling associated with a strip of land. And we saw that with Masjid al-Dirar, that before they built this mosque, there would have been no problem for anybody going there and offering prayer. But once they built this mosque, this place, and they built it with these evil intentions, it became a place where prayer was not allowed. You guys see that? So when we do something which is an act of disobedience to Allah, it can actually affect the perception and rulings associated with a piece of land. Let's look now at number 6. He says, it is prohibited to fulfill the vows in a place if there were present an idol of the idols of the times of ignorance, even after the idol is removed and the act of idolatry has ended. Because he asked them, Hal kana fiha wathanun min awthani al-jahiliyyah. He said, were there any idols from the pre-Islamic period of ignorance? Meaning they might not be there now, but they were there before and people know about it. And they said no. So he said he derived from that we don't fulfill vows, and vows are good things. They're acts of worship and we get close to Allah. We don't do these good things in places where idolatry was practiced, even if the idol that used to be worshipped has what? Has been basically removed. That's true as long as, or provided, that the remnants of those beliefs and the knowledge of those deities remains in effect. But once people no longer associate the place with those deities and those idolatrous practices, then the ruling, it changes and it becomes permitted. You guys understand that? So let's say, Ahsant. Or other places where they used to practice idolatry, but
I mean, all of Mecca, they would
exactly
gods, their idols,
exactly.
the city.
But once it changes and the perception of that place changes and people no longer associated with the idols and the idol worship, then the ruling would also change. So and turn into a mosque, and it's no longer associated. They take off the crosses, they take off, they take up the carpet, they change the pews, they change the appearance of it. It's no longer associated with Christianity. It now becomes associated, and people no longer associate the place with it being what? A church. There might be a place where people would go out and worship a false deity, and decades, centuries pass, and you'd have to actually do research to find out the origins of this place and what people used to do. And it's no longer associated. People would never think to connect this place with idolatry. Then what? Then the ruling changes and it becomes acceptable. And the reason why the Prophet was on the verge of prohibiting him was because he asked them, was there, to your knowledge, a wathanun min othanihim? Yu'bad. Was there a deity or an idol from their idols which was worshipped there, to your knowledge? And when they said no, right, then he allowed it. Meaning there could have been, but not to our knowledge. Prior to our knowledge, there could have been. Now, as I'm pondering this and preparing for tonight, I started thinking about a question that somebody asked me a few years back. And that was about wearing Nikes. And they asked me, is it okay to wear like Nikes? Because Nike is one of the Greek gods, right? And I said, that's a good question. Let me think about that, right? But I'm going to ask you honestly, when people wear Nikes nowadays, except people who have actively, studied or familiarized themselves or have some general familiarity with the concept of like these Greek gods and their names and what they stand for, do people associate Nike with what? Nobody. They don't even know that's what it is, most people. And so that's got me to thinking that perhaps this is the evidence that, it's okay for people to wear those. Even if somebody were to abstain out of an abundance of caution, we wouldn't blame him for that. But if people do wear them and they say, they're no longer associated, the concept of that is no longer associated with that name, they would say, that makes sense, because our religion tells us that once the concept or the connection or the perception exactly is no longer associated with that thing, the ruling will then change accordingly. Go ahead, Muhammad. Hey. Yeah.
Some people associate Jordan as being an idol.
Wow. Hey. I mean, if people idolize him, I don't know if they idolize him to the point of like a deity, but they idolize him in terms of like his celebrity and but not idolize him to the point of a deity. Allah knows best.
They don't pray to him. Well, they are. Well, I do want to. I mean, there are American idols that people they don't pray to them,
Mm-hmm.
but the way they watch them, the way they imitate them, the
Subhanallah.
way they try to be, whatever it might be, dress like them, act like them.
Allah.
them.
Yeah, but I mean,
Man, they call them idols. Yeah, there's no.
Like Yeezy calls himself like God.
Oh, the blood. Yeah, he just needs to stay on his meds, man. He just needs to stay on his meds. That's all.
Made hard to have on a pair of Nike slippers.
Really?
Yes.
They didn't give you a hard time, did they?
No, Nike to me was just a pair of flip flops.
And I say most people don't associate it. You'd have to bring it up to somebody and say, yeah, you're right. Yeah. And so because of that, I incline toward the belief that, it's no longer, that association is no longer there, and therefore the ruling, it would not be affected.
Have like a masjid that just opened, like the brother's talking about. They bought a church, they turned it into a masjid. And everybody at first goes, "Oh, it's the old church."
Hey.
The old church.
Hey.
I mean, does that influence our ability for our prayers to be accepted?
I don't think so, just because of, like, historically, this has taken place and the Muslims never took that. Like, if you say logically, just drawing from the text, that would be your first mind. But then when we look at the practice of the Muslims throughout the centuries, they've done that and they haven't looked at it like that. So that means that either they make an exception there, or there's some other excuse for allowing it here. And maybe because of the demand for a place for Muslims to pray overrides the concern about, like you said, giving that impression or that false impression.
Like in Tampa, they have a masjid called Jesus, Son of Mary.
Yeah, and it used to be a church.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
that's kind of close there.
Yeah, that's deep. That's deep.
The thing about it is that may draw Christians into there
Hey.
and give them dawah.
Well, it does. Churches actually cut checks to that mosque by mistake.
Really?
Yeah, and then when they let them know, some of them ask for their money back, and some of them
Just
they keep it.
keep it.
Yeah,
Wow.
but they sense it's a church by the name of it.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, let me do one more before we close out. And that is number 9, which says, a warning against resembling the polytheists in their celebrations, even if not intended. Meaning the Muslims' intention would not be the same as that of the polytheists, or they do it by accident, right? So now here, this is a very good point that he mentions, and obviously he takes it from the hadith of Thabit bin Dhahak, where he told him, is there an Eid or a celebration that they observe, or a festival that they observe there? Basically, what the Prophet is saying, don't do something special in a place where they observe their special occasions. Don't imitate them. Don't do something which makes it seem as if you are resembling them in their what? In their ayat, in their celebrations or the places that they deem special. And so here will be a good time to just mention ala ujala quickly some of the important notes on the subject of imitating and mimicking the non-believers. So number 1, there's something in Islam called the prohibited imitation of the non-believers. And that prohibited imitation refers to doing anything which is specific to them. It has to be something specific to them, something which is generally associated with them and no one else. So it has to be something specific, not something mushtarak, not something that we do and they do. For example, we eat with forks, they eat with forks. That would not be the prohibited tashabbuh, right? But they have certain hairstyles that only they have. So for example, certain followers of the Jewish faith, they have these curly, right, that hang down. That's the hairstyle. When you see somebody with that hairstyle, immediately you associate them with what? With Orthodox Jewry, right? So, or Judaism, I'm sorry. So similarly, a Muslim couldn't do what? Couldn't do that because why? It's something when a person sees you wearing that will automatically associate you with that faith. That's what we mean. That's not the only example, but it's just one very prominent example that I can give to show you what we're talking about, something what? Specific to them. And this is something which is prohibited, or this is something which the scholars have agreed on as far as being the babit, the determining factor for what is and what isn't the prohibited imitation. So for example, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hajar, as-San'ani, al-Manawi, and other scholars have mentioned specifically this is what the Prophet is prohibiting when he says, for example, وَمَنْ تَشَبَّهَ بِقَوْمٍ فَهُوَ مِنْهُمْ. Whoever imitates a people, then he's from them. This is what we're talking about, imitating them in something which is specific to them. طيب, and this is something which is important for us to digest and understand. Why? Because we live in a culture, in a society, which is dominated by They're the dominant culture. The non-believers are the dominant culture. And what does the dominated culture typically do in a society dominated by another culture? They imitate. Exactly. They imitate and assimilate. And so we need to know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable so we avoid the prohibited imitation. So now this imitation, as we said, it is prohibited in our religion. So that could relate to their clothing, could relate to their hairstyles, could relate to their mannerisms, could relate to certain things that they say, certain things that they do, the way that they carry themselves. A lot of things, it's not just clothing and hairstyles, but it's everything which is specific to them we're not supposed to imitate. It's prohibited. And this is bil ijma', by agreement of the scholars, and it's supported by the hadith we just mentioned, by the hadith of Ibn Umar, man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Wa alaykum assalam wa barakatuh. Number 3 from the points is that a person does not have to intend to imitate them to be guilty of the prohibited imitation. This is important too. You don't have to intend it. People will do something and people will call them on and say, hey, what you're doing now is imitating a non-Muslim person. Well, I didn't know. And if I'm not intentionally imitating them, I'm not guilty. No, you're still guilty. You may not be sinful, but you're still guilty of imitating them because you don't have to have the intention. And we have lots of examples where the Prophet ﷺ and his companions would say, what you're doing is imitating them, even though the person had no knowledge. And one of the examples I can give is the hadith collected by Muslim on the authority of Abdullah ibn Amr, who said, رأى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم علي ثوبين معصفرين فقال أمك أمرتك بهذا قلت أغسلهما قال لا قال بل أحرقهما. And in the other version of it, he said, إن هذا من ثياب الكفار فلا تلبسها. He said, Abdullah ibn Amr, he said, one day the Prophet saw me wearing some clothing which was saffron colored, like a reddish yellow, right? Like a reddish yellow, saffron colored. And he asked me, he said, did your mother tell you to wear this? Did your mother dress you like that? Now, when the Prophet says that, what does Abdullah ibn Amr automatically know? That's not something you say. That's not something you say to show your approval or something, right? He's like, did your mother make you wear that? Right? Did your mother make you wear that? So he was like, okay, I get that you're telling me I shouldn't be wearing this. He said, what should I do? Should I wash it until what? Until the color changes? The Prophet said, no, take those and burn them. Take that garment and burn it. You're never going to get the color out completely, right? And another version of the same hadith, he said, these are the clothes of the non-Muslims, so don't wear them, right? So what did he basically told him? You're wearing something which is commonly worn by the non-Muslims. You're imitating them, whether you realize it or not, and don't do that. You guys see that? So the fact that he didn't know didn't prevent the Prophet from saying, you're imitating them. These are the clothes of non-Muslims, don't wear them. You guys see that? Okay, number 4 from the issues. What if the act that we imitate them in is an act of worship? It's an act of worship. That would make it even more prohibited. If we're prohibited from imitating them in things which have nothing to do with worship, we're even more prohibited from imitating them in things that have to do with worship. And this is the meaning of the statement of Allah when he says in chapter Al-Kafirun, he says, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. Say, O Muhammad, and by extension, say believer, say Muslim. O you disbelievers, لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. I don't worship what you worship. I don't worship the way you worship. I don't worship in the same fashion as you worship. And then at the end of it, he says, لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ. You have your religion, I have mine. We're what? We're different. We have 2 separate paths, and they don't what? They don't intersect. So this is the meaning of that. And what's necessitated by that we don't imitate them generally, and we definitely don't imitate them in things that are related to acts of worship. The number 5, the wisdom. Why does Allah tell us not to imitate them? Why does the messenger tell us not to imitate them? Why do we have so many hadith where the Prophet says, don't imitate the non-Muslims, be different from the non-Muslims? Why? The wisdom is because, as Ibn Taymiyyah mentions in Al-Iqtidah, he says that when you imitate people on the outside, that gives birth to love, affection, and affinity on the what? On the inside. And what do they say? And there's a common statement in our language, in our vernacular, that says that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. The greatest way to show somebody that you really love them is when you imitate them. You guys see that? So imitation is the greatest form of flattery. When you have a son and that son does what you do, they walk the way you walk, right? They talk the way you talk. They hold their head the way you hold your head. That flatters you. That makes you feel inside, my son what? Loves me, cares for me, admires me, because he's imitating me. When you imitate people on the outside, it's an indication that you admire them on what? On the inside. Should a Muslim admire the non-Muslims? That's why. That's the wisdom why we're not supposed to imitate them on the outside, because it'll lead us to admire them on the inside. Like, think about that, number 6. Suppose something is originated by the non-Muslims. They're the first ones to do it. And then over time, Muslims begin to what? To adopt it. And as time passes, pretty soon, it becomes something common and shared. It's no longer specific to the non-Muslims. If a Muslim now does that thing, would they be guilty of the prohibited imitation? No, they wouldn't be guilty. For example, when the British came and they colonized India, the Indians did not wear pants, the pants that we know, right? They did have like these balloon pants, right? They had these, but they didn't have what they called pantalon, like the pants that we wear, the Western pants. They didn't wear that. The British people wore that. And the scholars of that time would write these fatwa telling the Muslims who were now colonizing India that you can't wear these pants because wearing it would be imitating the non-Muslims. Okay? So, but obviously, you're dominated, you're conquered by a people, and the conquered typically start to imitate the conquerors, right? So they did. They started wearing those pants. And pretty soon, over time, wearing those pants became common between something shared between the British conquerors and the Muslims who had been conquered. And then it went what? Throughout the world, to the point that Muslims wear these pants as much as what? As non-Muslims. And they're no longer associated with the non-Muslims or considered a non-Muslim form of dress. If a Muslim were to wear these pants now, these Western pants now, would they be guilty of imitation of the non-Muslims? No, because what? Because it changed. What makes it imitate the prohibited imitation? It has to be something specific to them. So yes, the first Muslims who started wearing these garments and doing these things, they were guilty of the prohibited imitation. But over time, the ruling changed, which teaches you that the ruling of a tashabbuh, it changes from time to time and from place to place. What may have been tashabbuh at a certain time is no longer what? A tashabbuh. And what may be tashabbuh in a certain place, the prohibited imitation, is not what? Prohibited imitation in another place. Why? Because the circumstances are different. It has to be something specific to the non-Muslims. Once it no longer becomes specific, it no longer becomes from that category of prohibited imitation. Even if it's not from that prohibited imitation, we're still encouraged to what? To be different from them. Even though it's not from the prohibited imitation, our religion still tells us what? To have this uniquely Islamic identity and to be different from them. And the Prophet used to do this a lot. There were things that the people of his time would do. He would do it differently. So for example, when he first came to Al-Madinah, he used to part his hair a certain way. And it was similar to the way that the people of Medina, particularly the Jews, would part their hair. So then he started parting his hair differently. And he would tell the Muslims a lot of times, Khaliful Yahuda wal Nasara, Khaliful Mushrikeen, Khaliful Mujus. Be different from the Jews and Christians, be different from the fire worshippers, be different from the pagans. And so he would intentionally do things contrary to them and tell the believers to be different. So for example, is there any harm in a Muslim praying shoeless? Going out to a park and taking off his shoes in the grass and praying shoeless. Is there any harm in that? And certainly when we come to our masajid with these carpets in the modern era, we certainly take off our shoes because we don't want to ruin the carpet or make the carpet have a bad smell, right? Or bring things from outside in to the filthy things from outside into the masjid, right? But the Prophet used to tell the Muslims, he used to say, Khaliful Yahud, La yusalluna fi ni'alihim, fasallu fi ni'alikum. He used to say, the Jews don't pray in their sandals. So be different from them. Pray in your sandals. So every opportunity a Muslim would get to, he would pray in his sandals. Here, not praying in sandals, there's nothing wrong with that. But the Prophet is saying intentionally be different from them. Even in these things where there's no harm if you imitate them. You guys see that? And there's nothing specific about it. There's nothing specific to them about it. Another example, for example, people who wear watches, and it's not to pick on you, right? People who wear watches, right? Okay, typically men wear watches what? On the left, right? If a person intentionally did what? Put on his right to be different from them. You guys see that? So you're intentionally, intently being different from them. This is a good thing. And that's why the Prophet has so many hadith where he prefaces it by saying, be different from them, be different from them. And he'll tell you, give an example of being different. The last thing I'll mention and we'll close out is that when the Prophet prohibits us from imitating the disbelievers, it's not restricted to them. It's not restricted to them. But rather, the Muslims are supposed to be different and to be contradictory to everything which is deficient, everything which is of a lesser status, whether that lesser status has to do with intellect or spirituality or morality. So, for example, the Muslims have been prohibited from imitating animals, right? Walking like them, speaking like them, wearing things that make us resemble them, right? And you'll find examples where the Prophet says, for example, to the believers, he says, for example, La yabruk ahadukum kama yabruk al-ba'ir. When one of you goes down to prostrate, don't prostrate the way a camel prostrates, right? Don't go down the way a camel goes down. Don't imitate animals. They're lesser than you, right? He also would say, for example, that when we prostrate, we shouldn't prostrate the way a dog prostrates, which means what? We shouldn't have our elbows on the ground. You guys see that? He's telling them, don't imitate the animals. Don't be like them. Also, the uncivilized people. The Prophet used to discourage the Arabs of Al-Hadara, the civilized Arabs, the city Arabs, from imitating the Arabs of what? Al-A'rab, the people who lived out the Bedouins, because they had certain crass behaviors and etc. He used to tell them, don't be like them. Don't do that, right? Because exactly, they're lesser than you in that sense. They do uncivilized things. Don't be uncivilized like them. Another example, and this is important for us, is the morally depraved and wicked Muslims. So you have certain Muslims who do things, and people will justify doing those things because they'll say, well, some Muslims do that. I know a brother, he does that, or a sister that does that. Or if the people who are doing it are wicked, they're of a what? Lesser status. They're from the naqa'is. They're from the deficient people. And so we don't imitate the people who are of a lesser status because of their moral decadence. And so this is important for us to understand too, is that the people that we imitate are the people who are worthy of being imitated, the prophets, the messengers, the righteous people. You guys see that? And we never worship people who we would normally look down upon. All right, any questions, comments, or تفضل شيخ. Hey.
So does that mean if a Muslim imitate kuffar, so
Hey.
does that mean we exclude that from Aqidah, or just what's the meaning?
Well, what Ibn Taymiyyah said, he said, ظاهر الحديث, he said, أقل ما يستفاد من الحديث تحريم التشبه وإن كان ظاهر الحديث يفيد كفر من تشبه بهم. So he said, the least that we can take away from the hadith is that we're prohibited from imitating them. Although if you take the apparent meaning of the hadith, it would mean that the person who imitates them becomes a disbeliever. Now, because the scholars have never interpreted like that, we say that that's not what the Prophet intended, even though that's the apparent meaning of the hadith. But it's a very strong way of saying, don't imitate them. It's a very strong way, because he's saying if you imitate them, then you become one of them, almost like you've left the deen, although you haven't left the deen. But it's a very strong way of discouraging the Muslims from imitating them. And think about that in comparison to what we're seeing from the level of imitation, and how so many Muslims look up to non-Muslims as the gold standard in terms of everything. And in many cases, whatever the circumstances, whatever the subject is, people will be told, well, this is the way, this is what Islam says. And people will reject that or dismiss it and prefer to follow the non-Muslim way of doing things. I'll give you one example. For example, in the running of the masajid, you'll have these people who will create these constitutions. And many of the articles in the Constitution go against what Islam says and what the teachings of Islam says. And when this is brought to people's attention, they say, Islamically, we can't do that. People will dismiss and ignore what Islam says and will go with the constitutions which they're drafting, which are based upon constitutions from non-profit organizations created and established by non-Muslims. That these constitutions become the law. For example, you have people who will say that a person will do something Islamic in the mosque, and a person will say, this is against the Constitution, you're going against the Constitution, and they'll have more zeal and more angst and more anger in the fact that the Constitution has been violated as opposed to Islam being violated. And again, why? Because we have elevated the non-Muslims to a status where we want to be like them. We want to imitate them in everything, even in our own Islamically specific affairs.
And also, I mean, each thing it takes some time. So once we start, step by step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It becomes like a snowball rolling down a mountain. Yeah. ذراعاً وذراعاً حتى لو دخلوا جحر ضب لدخلتموه. Yeah, if they enter into a lizard's hole, you would enter there. Allah yubarak fikum. And with that, brothers and sisters, we'll bring today's session to a close. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam. You got something, Muhammad?
Have you heard anything about Muslims and the Christians praying together in the mosque?
Interfaith.
Mm-hmm.
Interfaith. That's what they call it.
Well, yeah, interfaith.
Mm-hmm.
This was in Spain or something.
Really?
Yeah.
Where was it at?
Don't quote me on this, but in Spain, so we used to worship together. They had one part of the mosque and one part of the...
I know there was a period when the Umayyads, when they fled from Mecca, or when they fled from the Islamic State in the Arabian Peninsula, and they took refuge in Spain, and they established the Islamic State in the West, right? When that happened, there was a period where there was a large church, and they basically did get permission from the Christians there to worship there in that church. Yeah. That did happen. But again, as I said, historically, because that place was ultimately turned into a mosque, historically, this is an exception which the Muslims have made historically. This is an exception. So we have this general rule, but when it came to this specifically, they operated differently. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.